The Jesse Owens incident. As we both know, Liesel wasn't on hand on Himmel Street when Rudy performed his act of childhood infamy. When she looked back, though, it felt like she'd actually been there. In her memory, she had somehow become a member of Rudy's imaginary audience. Nobody else mentioned it, but Rudy certainly made up for that, so much that when Liesel came to recollect her story, the Jesse Owens incident was as much a part of it as everything she witnessed firsthand. It was 1936, the Olympics, Hitler's Games. Jesse Owens had just completed the 4x100 meter relay and won his fourth gold medal. Talk that he was subhuman because he was black and Hitler's refusal to shake his hand were touted around the world. Even the most racist Germans were amazed with the efforts of Owens, and word of his feat slipped through the cracks. No one was more impressed than Rudy Steiner. Everyone in his family was crowded together in their family room when he slipped out and made his way to the kitchen. He pulled some charcoal from the stove and gripped it in the smallness of his hands. Now there was a smile. He was ready. He smeared the charcoal on nice and thick till he was covered in black. Even his hair received a once-over. In the window, the boy grinned almost maniacally at his reflection, and in his shorts and tank top, he quietly abducted his older brother's bike and pedaled it up the street, heading for Hubert Oval. In one of his pockets, he'd hidden a few pieces of extra charcoal in case some of it wore off later. In Liesel's mind, the moon was sewn into the sky that night. Clouds were stitched around it. The rusty bike crumbled to a halt at the Hubert Oval fence line, and Rudy climbed over. He landed on the other side and trotted weedily up toward the beginning of the 100. Enthusiastically, he conducted an awkward regimen of stretches. He dug starting holes into the dirt, waiting for his moment. He paced around, gathering concentration under the darkness sky, with the moon and the clouds watching tightly. Owens is looking good, he began to commentate. This could be his greatest victory ever. He shook the imaginary hands of the other athletes and wished them luck, even though he knew they didn't have a chance. The starter signaled them forward. A crowd materialized around every square inch of Hubert Oval's circumference. They were all calling out one thing. They were chanting Rudy Steiner's name, and his name was Jesse Owens. All fell silent. His bare feet gripped the soil. He could feel it holding on between his toes. At the request of the starter, he raised to crouching position, and the gun clipped a hole in the night. For the first third of the race, it was pretty even, but it was only a matter of time before the charcoaled Owens drew clear and streaked away. Owens in front, the boy's shrill voice cried as he ran down the empty track, straight toward the uproarious applause of Olympic glory. He could even feel the tape break in two across his chest as he burst through it in first place, the fastest man alive. It was only on his victory lap that things turned sour. Among the crowd, his father was standing at the finish line like the boogeyman, or at least the boogeyman in a suit. As previously mentioned, Rudy's father was a tailor. He was rarely seen on the street without a suit and tie. On this occasion, it was only the suit and a disheveled shirt. "What is lost?" he said to his son when he showed up in all his charcoal glory. "What is going on here?" The crowd vanished. A breeze sprang up. "I was asleep in my chair when Kurt noticed you were gone. Everyone's out looking for you." Mr. Steiner was a remarkably polite man under normal circumstances. Discovering one of his children smeared charcoal black on a summer evening was not what he considered normal circumstances. "The boy is crazy," he muttered, although he conceded that with 6 kids, something like this was bound to happen. At least one of them had to be a bad egg. Right now he was looking at it, waiting for an explanation. "Well?" Rudy panted, bending down and placing his hand on his knees. "I was being Jesse Owens," he answered, as though it was the most natural thing on earth to be doing. There was even something implicit in his tone that suggested something along the lines of, "What does it look like?" The tone vanished, however, when he saw the sleep deprivation whittled under his father's eyes. Jesse Owens? Mr. Steiner was the type of man who was very wooden. His voice was angular and true. His body was tall and heavy, like oak. His hair was like splinters. What about him? You know, Papa, the black magic one. I'll give you black magic. He caught his son's ear between his thumb and forefinger. Rudy winced. Ow, that really hurts. Does it? His father was more concerned with the clammy texture of charcoal contaminating his fingers. He covered everything, didn't he? He thought. It's even in his ears. Come on. On the way home, Mr. Steiner decided to talk politics with the boy as best he could. Only in the years ahead would Rudy understand it all, when it was too late to bother understanding anything. The contradictory politics of Alex Steiner. Point 1. He was a member of the Nazi Party, but he did not hate the Jews, or anyone else for that matter. Point 2. Secretly, though, he couldn't help feeling a percentage of relief, or worse, gladness, when Jewish shop owners were put out of business. Propaganda informed him that it was only a matter of time before a plague of Jewish tailors showed up and stole his customers. Point 3. But did that mean they should be driven out completely? Point 4. His family. Surely he had to do whatever he could to support them. If that meant being in the party, it meant being in the party. Point 5. Somewhere far down, there was an itch in his heart, but he made it a point not to scratch it. He was afraid of what might come leaking out. They walked around a few corners onto Himmel Street, and Alex said, Son, you can't go around painting yourself black, you hear? Rudy was interested and confused. The moon was undone now, free to move and rise and fall and drip on the boy's face, making him nice and murky like his thoughts. Why not, Papa? Because they'll take you away. Why? Because you shouldn't want to be like black people or Jewish people or anyone who is not us. Who are Jewish people? You know my oldest customer, Mr. Kaufman, where we bought your shoes? Yes? Well, he's Jewish. I didn't know that. Do you have to pay to be Jewish? Do you need a license? No, Rudy. Mr. Steiner was steering the bike with one hand and Rudy with the other. He was having trouble steering the conversation. He still hadn't relinquished the hold on his son's earlobe. He'd forgotten about it. It's like you're German or Catholic. Oh, is Jesse Owens Catholic? I don't know. He tripped on a bike pedal then and released the ear. They walked on in silence for a while until Rudy said, I just wish I was like Jesse Owens, Papa. This time Mr. Steiner placed his hand on Rudy's head and explained, I know, son, but you've got beautiful blonde hair and big, safe blue eyes. You should be happy with that. Is that clear? But nothing was clear. Rudy understood nothing, and that night was the prelude of things to come. 2.5 years later, the Kaufman shoe shop was reduced to broken glass, and all the shoes were flung aboard a truck in their boxes. I love that chapter. The Rudy Steiner, the Jesse Owens incident chapter. It's about Rudy. The other side of sandpaper. People have defining moments, I suppose, especially when they're children. For some, it's a Jesse Owens incident. For others, it's a moment of bedwetting hysteria. It was late May 1939, and the night had been like most others. Mama shook her iron fist, Papa was out, Liesel cleaned the front door and watched the Himmel Street sky. Earlier there had been a parade. The brown-shirted extremist members of the NSDAP, otherwise known as the Nazi Party, had marched down Munich Street, their banners worn proudly, their faces held high as if on sticks. Their voices were full of song, culminating in a roaring rendition of Deutschland über alles, Germany over everything. As always, they were clapped. They were spurred on as they walked to who knows where. People on the street stood and watched, some with straight armed salutes, others with hands that burned from applause. Some kept faces that were contorted by pride and rally like fraudiller, and then there were the scatterings of odd men out, like Alex Steiner, who stood like a human-shaped block of wood, clapping slow and beautiful submission. On the footpath, Liesel stood with her Papa and Rudy. Hans Habermann wore a face with the shades pulled down. Some crunched numbers. In 1933, 90% of Germans showed unflinching support for Adolf Hitler. That leaves 10% who didn't. Hans Haberman belonged to the 10%. There was a reason for that. So, Alex Steiner, guys, the father of Rudy, he is considered part of the Nazi party, and he knows it's wrong. It said he knows deep in his heart that there's wrong. There was an itch in his heart that told him it was wrong, but for his family, he was like, I can't put my family in danger, so I'll go along. No, I'll support the Nazi party. But Hans Haberman, he was one of the few. And I mean, this is a real study. 90% of the Germans in World War II times supported Hitler, 10% didn't. Hans Haberman was of that 10%. So he went even beyond what Rudy Steiner did. Know something's wrong, but you go along with it. But Hans Haberman knew it was wrong, and he didn't. He didn't support it good. He wasn't a Nazi. In the night, Liesel dreamed like she always did. At first she saw the brown shirts marching, but soon enough they led her to a train, and the usual discovery awaited. Her brother was staring again. When she woke up screaming, Liesel knew immediately that on this occasion something had changed. A smell leaked out from under the sheets, warm and sickly. At first, she tried convincing herself that nothing had happened, but as Papa came closer and held her, she cried and admitted the fact in his ear. Papa, she whispered. Papa, and that was all. He could probably smell it. He lifted her gently from the bed and carried her into the washroom. The moment came a few minutes later. We take the sheets off, Papa said. And when he reached under and pulled at the fabric, something loosened and landed with a thud. The black book with the silver writing on it came hurtling out and landed on the floor between the tall man's feet. He looked down at it. He looked at the girl, who timidly shrugged. Then he read the title with concentration aloud. The Grave Digger's Handbook. So that's what it's called, Liesel thought. A patch of silence stood among them now, the man, the girl, the book. He picked it up and spoke soft as cotton. A 2 a.m. conversation. Is this yours? Yes, Papa. Do you want to read it? Again, yes, Papa. A tired smile, metallic eyes melting. Well, we'd better read it then. 4 years later, when she came to write in the basement, two thoughts struck Liesel about the trauma of wetting the bed. First, she felt extremely lucky that it was Papa who discovered the book. Fortunately, when the sheets had been washed previously, Rosa had made Liesel strip the bed and make it up. And be quick about it, Sommensch. Does it look like we've got all day? Second, she was clearly proud of Hans Haberman's part in her education. You wouldn't think it, she wrote, but it was not so much the school who helped me to read. It was Papa. People think that he's not so smart, and it's true that he doesn't read too fast. But I would soon learn that words and writing actually saved his life once. Or at least words and a man who taught him the accordion. First things first, Hans Haberman said that night. He washed the sheets and hung them up. Now, he said upon his return, let's get this midnight class started. The yellow light was alive with dust. Liesel sat on cold, clean sheets, ashamed, elated. The thought of bed wetting prodded her, but she was going to read. She was going to read the book. The excitement stood up in her. Visions of a 10-year-old reading genius were set alight. If only it was that easy. To tell you the truth, Papa exclaimed up front, I am not such a good reader myself. But it didn't matter that he read slowly. If anything, it might have helped that his own reading pace was slower than average. Perhaps it would cause less frustration in coping with the girl's lack of ability. Still, initially, Hans appeared a little uncomfortable holding the book and looking through it. When he came over and sat next to her on the bed, he leaned back, his legs angling over the side. He examined the book again and dropped it on the blanket. Now why would a nice girl like you want to read such a thing? Again Liesel shrugged. Had the apprentice been reading the complete works of Goethe or any other such luminary, that was what would have sat in front of him. She attempted to explain. When it was sitting in the snow and... The soft-spoken words fell off the side of the bed, emptying to the floor like powder. Papa knew what to say, though. He always knew what to say. He ran a hand through his sleepy hair and said, Well, promise me one thing, Liesel. If I die anytime soon, you make sure they bury me right." She nodded with great sincerity. No skipping chapter 6 or step 4 in chapter 9. He laughed, as did the bedwetter. "Well, I'm glad that's settled. We can get on with it now." He adjusted his position and his bones creaked like itchy floorboards. The fun begins. Amplified by the still of night, the book opened, a gust of wind. Looking back, Liesel could tell exactly what her papa was thinking when he scanned the first page of the Gravedigger's Handbook. As he realized the difficulty of the text, he was clearly aware that such a book was hardly ideal. There were words in there that he'd have trouble with himself, not to mention the morbidity of the subject. As for the girl, there was a sudden desire to read it that she didn't even attempt to understand. On some level, perhaps she wanted to make sure her brother was buried right. Whatever the reason, her hunger to read that book was as intense as any 10-year-old human could experience, okay? You know what's so cool and beautiful is that it's a book narrated by death. And the first book that the book thief wants to read is a Gravedigger's Handbook, a book that teaches you how to bury the dead. And the one telling this story is death. It feels like a poem. Everything is so well planned by Marcus Zusak. There's so many symbols and metaphors and connections, and I love this book. I hope you're loving it too. Chapter 1 was called The First Step, Choosing the Right Equipment. In a short introductory passage, it outlined the kind of material to be covered in the following 20 pages. Types of shovels, picks, gloves, and so forth were itemized, as well as the vital need to properly maintain them. This grave digging was serious. As Papa flicked through it, he could surely feel Liesel's eyes on him. They reached over and gripped him, waiting for something, anything, to slip from his lips. "Here." He shifted again and handed her the book. "Look at this page and tell me how many words you can read." She looked at it and lied. "About half." "Read some for me." But of course she couldn't. When he made her point out any words she could read and actually say them, there were only 3, the 3 main German words for the. The whole page must have had 200 words on it. This might be harder than I thought. She caught him thinking it just for a moment. He lifted himself forward, rose to his feet, and walked out. This time when he came back, he said, "Actually, I have a better idea." In his hand, there was a thick painter's pencil and a stack of sandpaper. "Let's start from scratch." Liesel saw no reason to argue. In the left corner of an upturned piece of sandpaper, he drew a square of perhaps an inch and shoved a capital A inside it. In the other corner, he placed a lowercase one. So far, so good. "Ah," Liesel said. "Ah for what?" She smiled. "Apfel." He wrote the word in big letters and drew a misshapen apple under it. He was a house painter, not an artist. When it was complete, he looked over and said, "Now for ba." As they progressed through the alphabet, Liesel's eyes grew larger. She had done this at school in the kindergarten class, but this time was better. She was the only one there, and she was not gigantic. It was nice to watch Papa's hand as he wrote the words, and slowly constructed the primitive sketches. "Ah, come on, Liesel," he said when she struggled later on. "Something that starts with S. It's easy. I'm very disappointed in you." She couldn't think. "Come on," he whispered. He whisper-played with her. "Think of Mama." That was when the word struck her face like a slap, a reflex grin. "Samensch!" she shouted, and Papa roared with laughter, then quieted. "Shh, we have to be quiet." But he roared all the same and wrote the word, completing it with one of his sketches. A typical Hans Huberman artwork. And then he drew this stick figure. "Papa," she whispered, "I have no eyes." He patted the girl's hair. She'd fallen into his trap. With a smile like that, Hans Huberman said, "You don't need eyes." He hugged her and then looked again at the picture with a face of warm silver. "Now for ta." With the alphabet completed and studied a dozen times, Papa leaned over and said, "Enough for tonight? A few more words." He was definite. "Enough. When you wake up, I'll play accordion for you. Thanks, Papa. Good night. A quiet one-syllable laugh. Good night, Somenge. Good night, Papa. He switched off the light, came back, and sat in the chair. In the darkness, Liesel kept her eyes open. She was watching the words. And so, Liesel is learning how to read, with her papa. Late at night. So cute. The smell of friendship. It continued. Over the next few weeks and into summer, the midnight class began at the end of each nightmare. There were 2 more bedwetting occurrences, but Hans Huberman merely repeated his previous cleanup heroics and got down to the task of reading, sketching, and reciting. In the morning's early hours, quiet voices were loud. On a Thursday, just after 3 p.m., Mama told Liesel to get ready to come with her and deliver some ironing. Papa had other ideas. He walked into the kitchen and said, "Sorry, Mama, she's not going with you today." Mama didn't even bother looking up from the washing bag. "Who asked you? Come on, Liesel." "She's reading," he said. Papa handed Liesel a steadfast smile and a wink. "With me. I'm teaching her. We're going to the Ampere upstream where I used to practice the accordion." Now he had her attention. Mama placed the washing on the table and eagerly worked herself up to the appropriate level of cynicism. "What did you say?" "I think you heard me, Rosa." Mama laughed. What could you teach her?" A cardboard grin uppercut words. "Like you could read so much, you sock girl." The kitchen waited. Papa counterpunched. "We'll take your ironing for you." "You filthy..." She stopped. The words propped in her mouth as she considered it. "Be back before dark." "We can't read in the dark, Mama," Liesel said. "What was that, Somenge?" "Nothing, Mama." Papa grinned and pointed at the girl. "Book, sandpaper, pencil," he ordered her. "And accordion." Once she was already gone. Soon they were on Himmel Street carrying the words, the music, the washing. As they walked toward Frau Diller's, they turned around a few times to see if Mama was still at the gate, checking on them. She was. At one point she called out, "Liesel, hold that ironing straight, don't crease it." "Yes, Mama." A few steps later, "Liesel, are you dressed warm enough?" "What did you say?" "Somenge, you never hear anything. Are you dressed warm enough? It might get cold later." Around the corner, Papa bent down to do up a shoelace. "Liesel," he said, "could you roll me a cigarette?" Nothing would give her greater pleasure. Once the ironing was delivered, they made their way back to the Ampere River, which flanked the town. It worked its way past, pointing in the direction of Dachau, the concentration camp. There was a wooden planked bridge. They sat maybe 30 meters down from it in the grass, writing the words and reading them aloud, and when darkness was near, Hans pulled out the accordion. Liesel looked at him and listened, though she did not immediately notice the perplexed expression on her papa's face that evening as he played. Papa's face, it traveled and wandered, but it disclosed no answers. Not yet. There had been a change in him, a slight shift. She saw it, but she didn't realize until later when all the stories came together. She didn't see him watching as he played, having no idea that Hans Huberman's accordion was a story. In the times ahead, that story would arrive at 33 Himmel Street in the early hours of morning, wearing ruffled shoulders and a shivering jacket. It would carry a suitcase, a book, and 2 questions. A story, story after story, story within story. So, we do know that there is good a story about how Hans Huberman learned the piano accordion. Someone taught him to play the accordion, and that story of him learning the accordion, this is going to be very important and very influential to the rest of this specific story. Okay, so that's why Death keeps referring to it, where someone taught him to play the accordion. This story is going to be very important later on. Death keeps mentioning it, no? Because it's going to come up later on, good. Something important, something that will alter the entire book is kind of rooted in that story of how Hans Huberman learned how to play this accordion. For now, there was only the one as far as Liesel was concerned, and she was enjoying it. She settled into the long arms of grass lying back. She closed her eyes, and her ears held the notes. There were, of course, some problems as well. A few times, Papa nearly yelled at her. "Come on, Liesel," he'd say. "You know this word. You know it." Just when progress seemed to be flowing well, somehow things would become lodged. When the weather was good, they'd go to the Ampere in the afternoon, and bad weather, it was the basement. This was mainly on account of Mama. At first they tried in the kitchen, but there was no way. Rosa, Hans said to her at one point, quietly, his words cut through one of her sentences. "Could you do me a favor?" She looked up from the stove. "What?" "I'm asking you. I'm begging you. Could you please shut your mouth for just 5 minutes?" You can imagine the reaction. They ended up in the basement. Okay, so he tried teaching her how to read in the kitchen, but you know Rosa, she cannot stop talking. She just complains about everything nonstop. And he finally said, like, "Can you be quiet for 5 minutes?" And then Rosa sent them to the basement. There was no lighting there, so they took a kerosene lamp, and slowly, between school and home, from the river to the basement, from the good days to the bad, Liesel was learning to read and write. Soon, Papa told her, "You'll be able to read that awful grave book with your eyes closed, and I can get out of that midget class." She spoke those words with a grim kind of ownership. In one of their basement sessions, Papa dispensed with the sandpaper. It was running out fast, and pulled out a brush. There were few luxuries in the Huberman household, but there was an oversupply of paint, and it became more than useful for Liesel's learning. Papa would say a word, and the girl would have to spell it aloud, and then paint it on the wall as long as she got it right. After a month, the wall was recoated, a fresh cement page. Some nights, after working in the basement, Liesel would sit crouched in the bath and hear the same utterances from the kitchen. "You stink," Mama would say to Hans, "like cigarettes and kerosene." Sitting in the water, she imagined the smell of it, mapped out on her papa's clothes. More than anything, it was the smell of friendship, and she could find it on herself too. Liesel loved that smell. She would sniff her arm and smile as the water cooled around her. Whoa, and we're only one more section away from finishing part 1! Man, this book's so easy to read. Like, really, it's not so tiring to read. And it's midnight. Alright, so, we're almost done with part 1. I want to finish this tonight, so click on the next video if you want to continue as well.